My name is Maribel Hayes, and I was 32 years old the night my parents decided my life needed correcting. It was the Sunday before Thanksgiving, 6 o'clock sharp, in the dining room where my mother kept the good china for people she wanted to impress. The candles were already lit. The silverware had been lined up like surgical tools. My sister Brielle sat across from me in a cream blazer, smiling the way people smile when they already know how the evening ends. My mother slid a folder across the table. It was wrapped with a pale blue ribbon. My father placed 2 fingers on top of it, as if he were blessing it, and said, "We just want you to be normal, Maribel." Nobody laughed. Nobody looked surprised. That was how I knew they had practiced. Inside the folder was an employment contract from Harbor Grace Living, executive personal assistant to Brielle Hayes Morton. Salary $112,000 a year. Health insurance. Relocation assistance. A start date circled in blue ink. My mother's eyes shone like she had handed me a future instead of a leash. Brielle leaned forward and touched my wrist. "This is a real chance, Mari. You don't have to keep doing little activities with old people forever." At the end of the table, Graham Sutter, Brielle's CEO, watched me over the rim of his water glass, too carefully, like he was waiting to see whether I recognized the trap before I stepped into it. What none of them knew was that I owned 54% of ElderBridge Systems, the software company Harbor Grace depended on to run its facilities. Our last valuation was $870 million, but I didn't say that. I looked at the ribbon, then at my father's hand still resting on the folder, and I wondered when my family had decided love meant making me easier to explain. Before we begin, please subscribe to support the channel. And here is a fun little challenge. Check your phone battery right now. If it is above 45%, comment 1. If it is below 45%, comment 2. Let's see which answer wins today. If you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, you can buy us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Every contribution helps us continue creating more meaningful, emotional, and captivating stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. Now, let's begin the story. 3 days before that dinner, I was not thinking about contracts or family rescue plans. I was sitting at a folding table in the back room of the Cedar Hollow Senior Activity Center, helping June Mercer sort her medication reminders into morning, noon, and evening. June was 69, a retired second-grade teacher with silver hair she pinned up every morning whether she had visitors or not. She still came to our center twice a week on Harbor Grace's shuttle, carrying a canvas bag full of crossword books, peppermint candies, and the yellow plastic bracelet the facility gave residents who were still considered independent enough. That bracelet was supposed to sync with Harbor Grace's resident tablet, send reminders, record check-ins, and keep everyone safe. That was the promise printed in soft blue letters on their brochures. But that afternoon, June tapped the bracelet with one finger and frowned. "They said I took the white pill last night," she whispered. "I don't think anybody came until after the news." She turned the tablet toward me herself. I didn't have access to her chart, only the reminder screen she was allowed to see. It showed her evening medication marked completed at 8:00 p.m. Clean, timely, perfect. June looked embarrassed, like forgetting was a moral failure. That was the thing about getting older in America. People did not have to take your voice all at once. They just had to make you doubt it first. I wrote the time down on a sticky note and slid it into my planner. I did not know yet that one small note would matter. I only knew June deserved to be believed before a screen was. Around 4, while I was stacking bingo cards back into a plastic bin, my mother called. Celeste Hayes never called without arranging her voice first. She had a church voice, a charity voice, a neighbor voice, and the soft little voice she used when she wanted to make an insult sound like concern. "Sunday dinner," she said. 6 o'clock. "Your father and I want everyone together. We're celebrating Brielle." I held the phone between my shoulder and ear, and wiped coffee rings off the table. "That's nice," I said. "What happened?" A pause followed. Not silence. "Theater. Harbor Grace named her regional operations director. Graham Sutter himself will be there. Pastor Clark, too. She let that sit, the way some people let expensive perfume enter a room before they do. Then came the turn. And Maribel, honey, wear something structured. Not one of those soft sweaters. You disappear in those. I looked down at the cardigan June had told me, made me look kind. Gray, loose, old at the elbows. I'll find something, I said. Good, my mother answered. Brielle has worked so hard to build a real life. I want the evening to feel important. A real life. Not a loud insult. Worse, a quiet measurement. In my family, Brielle had always been the example. Focused. Polished. Leadership material. She had calendar alerts for thank you notes and shoes that never looked walked in. I was the other daughter. Too private, too sensitive, hard to place. The one who remembered widows' appointments, but forgot to explain herself at dinner. My father used to call it drifting. My mother called it wasting potential. Brielle called it emotional fragility, usually while touching my hand. I called it breathing. After my mother hung up, I stood in the empty activity room and listened to the radiator knock behind the wall. On the table, June's sticky note sat half-tucked inside my planner. 8:00 p.m. marked complete. June says, after the news. I almost threw it away. Then something about the neatness of that record stopped me. The app was too clean. My mother's invitation had been too polished. Graham Sutter at a family dinner was too much for a simple celebration. When my mother said family dinner, I pictured a table, but by the time she mentioned Graham and Pastor Clark, I started to hear the boards of a stage. By Sunday evening, my mother's dining room looked less like a family meal and more like a ceremony where everyone knew the vows except me. The table was set for 8, though she had called it small. White linen, gold-rimmed plates, candles tall enough to make people careful with their elbows. At each seat sat a folded cream place card with a name written in Celeste's careful hand. Under most names, there was a second line. Ronald Hayes, retired banking vice president. Celeste Hayes, Women's Committee Chair. Brielle Hayes Morton, Regional Operations Director. Martin Voss had commercial insurance broker printed under his name. Graham Sutter had Chief Executive Officer. Pastor Edwin Clark had Senior Pastor. Mine said Maribel. Just Maribel. I stood there with my coat still on, looking at that little blank space beneath my name, and felt something inside me go very still. My mother appeared beside me, smelling like vanilla perfume and command. "Oh, honey," she said, touching my sleeve. "You wore gray again." Her voice was soft enough for guests, sharp enough for me. "Well," she added, lowering it, "we'll make it work." Brielle crossed the room in a cream blazer that matched the candles. She hugged me with one arm, the other hand holding a glass of sparkling water. "You made it," she said, like I had wandered in from bad weather instead of driving 12 minutes from my apartment. Martin gave me a sympathetic smile over her shoulder. The kind people give when they think your life is a cautionary tale. My father saw the place card in my hand, cleared his throat, and looked toward the kitchen instead of at me. Then my mother guided me toward Graham Sutter. "Graham, this is Maribel," she said brightly. "She helps with little senior activities at the community center. Reading circles, chair yoga, memory games, sweet work. Not exactly a career, but very sweet." The room gave the small, polite smile people offer when they are grateful the embarrassment belongs to someone else. Brielle looked into her glass. Pastor Clark's eyebrows drew together, just slightly, but he said nothing. I could have corrected her. I could have said Harbor Grace used my company's system every time a nurse checked a room, logged a medication, or answered an emergency alert. Instead, I smiled and asked Graham if he wanted tea. He did not answer right away. His eyes stayed on my face a second too long, not warm, not dismissive. Searching, like he had seen a signature he could not place. "That's kind of you," he said finally. "Eldercare is full of kind people." Then he smiled, and I realized he had not said it as a compliment. Graham's smile stayed with me through the salad course. Not because it was cruel. Cruelty is easy to name. His smile was worse than that. It was professional, polished. The kind of smile a man wears when he has already put you into a category and is waiting for you to prove you belong there. Kind, useful, harmless. My mother loved men like Graham because they made control sound like leadership. My father respected them because they used complete sentences before taking things. 10 years before that dinner, I was 22, and still trying to become the kind of daughter my parents could describe without lowering their voices. I had been enrolled in an MBA program in Harrisburg. Wearing blazers I hated and pretending group projects did not make me feel like I was not suffocating under fluorescent lights. Then Harold Pike got sick. Harold was Lenora's husband, a retired clock repairman with hands that trembled but still knew how to make broken gears move. Lenora lived 2 houses down from my parents on Maple Ridge Road when I was growing up. At first, I only stopped by after class. I brought soup, changed trash bags, sat with Harold while Lenora showered. Then hospice got complicated in that quiet way illness does. There were nurses, home aides, pharmacy deliveries, 3 different notebooks on the kitchen counter, and nobody looking at all of it at the same time. One Friday night, Harold missed a pain dose because the agency changed the evening aid, and the new schedule never made it to the pharmacy sheet. By the time I got there, Lenora was standing in the kitchen with the pill bottle in one hand and a printed calendar in the other, crying without making sound. I still remember the clock above her stove. 9:43 p.m. I remember Harold in the next room, trying not to groan because he did not want Lenora to hear him. I remember thinking that the cruelty was not one person forgetting. It was a system built so everyone could say their part was done while the person in pain carried the mistake in his body. I opened my old laptop at Lenora's kitchen table and made a simple tracking sheet. Dose, time, person responsible, confirmation, notes. Nothing brilliant, nothing investors would have applauded. Just one page that made it harder for a human being to disappear between shifts. My family treated that decision like proof I had lost ambition. I withdrew from the MBA program 2 weeks later, not because I wanted to abandon my future, but because I had finally seen a problem I could not unsee. At Sunday dinner, my father folded his napkin beside his plate and said, "You keep choosing broken people because you're afraid of competing with normal ones." He did not raise his voice. That was what made it land clean. My mother closed her eyes like he had said something painful but necessary. Brielle looked down at her phone. Nobody asked what Harold's name was. Nobody asked whether Lenora was sleeping. After Harold died, Lenora handed me the first printed version of that tracking sheet. She had kept it in a plastic sleeve, the way other people keep diplomas. In the corner, Harold had written in blue pen, shaky but readable, "This girl sees what systems miss." I laughed when I saw it, because I did not know what else to do. Lenora did not laugh. She tapped the paper and said, "Don't you dare let people call that softness." I took that page home and slid it into a drawer. Then, I took a night job in operations for a small hospice network, cleaning up scheduling errors no one wanted to own. That was the part my family never knew. They thought I had stepped off the road. The truth was, I had finally found one. Every insult after that became background noise with furniture polish and gravy. Naive, over-attached, wasting potential. They thought those words explained me. They did not know they were describing the exact reason I could see what their polished friends missed. And sitting across from Graham Sutter 10 years later, listening to him turn kindness into something small, I felt that old tracking sheet in my memory, like a document waiting for the right courtroom. The old tracking sheet was still folded in my memory when my father stood after dessert. He did it slowly, with both palms pressed to the table, like a man about to say grace over something already sacrificed. My mother touched his wrist and gave him the smallest nod. Brielle straightened in her chair. Martin stopped cutting the corner off his pecan pie. Pastor Clark looked from one face to another, and I understood, with a cold little click inside my chest, that everyone at that table knew a scene was coming, except the person it had been written for. "Maribel," my father began, unfolding a sheet of paper from his jacket pocket. His voice had that formal tremor men use when they want credit for doing something painful. "Your mother and I love you. That is why this is difficult." I looked at the paper, not at him. The sentences were too polished to be his. My mother's words fit badly in my father's mouth, but he read them anyway. He read about concern, about stability, about how 32 was not old, exactly, but old enough to stop drifting. He read the phrase, "a sustainable future," twice because the first time his voice caught. Then my mother stood, because my father had only ever been the opening act in our house. "Honey," she said, placing one hand over her heart, "we are not criticizing you. We are trying to give you structure before life gets harder." She turned slightly, making sure Graham and Pastor Clark could see her face. "A woman your age needs a plan. Freedom is not the same as floating." There it was, the little sermon wrapped around the leash. I felt every person at that table shift toward me, not with curiosity, but with expectation. They were waiting for the broken part of me to recognize the rescue. Brielle rose next and nudged the blue ribbon folder closer, as if the distance of a few inches was the last thing standing between me and salvation. "I asked HR to move quickly," she said. "It's a real position. Executive personal assistant to me at Harbor Grace. $112,000 a year. Benefits, relocation, help, everything." Her smile trembled with practiced tenderness. "You don't have to keep proving your little life is enough. Come work with me. I'll teach you structure, meetings, priorities, how to speak in rooms where decisions get made." Martin leaned back and added, "Honestly, Maribel, most people would be grateful for a second chance this generous." A second chance. I had signed a vendor renewal that morning large enough to make his lecture about gratitude feel almost tender in its ignorance. But I did not say that. I opened the folder. I let the pages slide under my fingers. Salary, start date, reporting structure, the tidy signature line with my full legal name already typed beneath it. Then I saw Section 9. Confidentiality and vendor non-association. No employment, consulting, advisory role, board participation, equity interest, or undisclosed financial relationship with any Eldercare technology vendor for the duration of employment and 24 months after termination. For 1 second, the room went very far away. Not because I was afraid, because the trap had finally shown its teeth. This was not an assistant job. This was a muzzle with health insurance. It might not take ElderBridge from me outright. It did not have to. It only had to give them enough language to threaten me with litigation. They could tie up my name, my company, and anything I knew about Harbor Grace under a confidentiality clause, broad enough to bury a nursing home. My mother saw me pause and mistook it for emotion. "See," she whispered. "Deep down, you know this is what you need." I looked across the table at Graham Sutter. He had not touched his pie. His hands were folded beside the plate, clean and still, too still. Brielle was watching my face, eager for gratitude. My father looked relieved, as if getting the paper in front of me was the hard part. Pastor Clark had stopped pretending to eat. I turned one more page and found the relocation clause. Lancaster within 30 days. Direct report to Brielle. All outside professional affiliations subject to Harbor Grace review. The language was not family language. It was containment language. "What happens if I say no?" I asked. My mother blinked first. "This is not a punishment, Maribel. That is not what I asked." Martin exhaled through his nose. Brielle's smile tightened. Graham finally spoke. "Opportunities like this are built on trust, Miss Hayes. If someone rejects help, people naturally wonder what they are protecting." There it was again. Care, shaped like a warning. I looked down at Section 9, at the words vendor, equity, disclosure, restriction, lined up like bars. And for the first time that night, I knew Graham Sutter had not come to celebrate my sister. He had come to find out whether the quiet woman at the table could be locked from the outside. I had not walked into that room empty-handed. 2 days before the dinner, while I was eating soup from a paper cup at my desk, an email landed in my personal inbox with the subject line Sunday Family Support Plan. At first, I thought my mother had finally learned to use calendar invites. Then, I saw the recipients. My parents, Brielle, Martin, Graham Sutter, and me, sitting there in the middle of the list like a loose thread nobody had noticed. The first message was from my mother. Don't call it an intervention until after dinner. She'll shut down. That was the phrase she used. Not cry, not argue. Shut down. Like I was a machine with faulty wiring. Brielle answered 6 minutes later. I'll present the assistant contract gently. She needs to feel chosen, not corrected. Martin added that Pastor Clark being there would help because I wouldn't embarrass myself in front of him. I remember putting my spoon down and staring at the screen until the soup went cold. Then Graham replied. No warmth, no family language, just a file attachment and one sentence. Use the protected version. The attachment was named HG Executive Assistant Agreement Final. I downloaded it before anyone realized I was still in the thread. A minute later, my mother sent another message. Wait, is Maribel on this? Then nothing. No apology, no explanation. Just a silence so clean it felt scrubbed. That was when hurt gave way to something steadier. If they were going to rehearse my future without me, I was going to keep the script. I did not respond. I saved the email as a PDF, downloaded the attachment, and checked the file properties the way Tobias Grant had trained all of us to do with suspicious documents. Tobias was ElderBridge's CFO, 58, calm as a locked vault, and allergic to panic. The document author field did not say Brielle. It did not say Harbor Grace HR. It said G. Sutter, admin. Created before the email thread ever started, and modified twice after my mother's first message. That was the moment I stopped thinking of the dinner as humiliation and started thinking of it as evidence. An hour later, Tobias called about something unrelated that turned out not to be unrelated at all. Harbor Grace had 3 facilities under review for medication reporting discrepancies. One of the names in the packet was June Mercer. Her resident reminder screen said 8:00 p.m. Her original system log said 10:17 p.m. Someone with executive access had changed the visible record after the fact. Tobias's voice stayed level, but I had known him long enough to hear the alarm beneath it. This is not a typo, Maribel, he said. Somebody cleaned the record. I opened my planner and looked at the sticky note from June. 8:00 p.m. marked complete. June says after the news. My mother's email sat on one side of my screen. Graham's protected contract sat on the other. Between them was the name of a woman who had been made to doubt her own memory because a system needed to look perfect. I asked Tobias to preserve the original logs, the metadata, and every access trail tied to Harbor Grace. He did not ask why. That was why he was Tobias. By the time Sunday arrived, I already knew 2 things. My family had planned to make me feel small. Graham Sutter had planned something colder than that. What I did not know yet was why a CEO would bother helping my mother corner her quiet daughter at a dining room table. I only knew the answer was somewhere between a contract meant to silence me and a medication record someone had cleaned too carefully. At the table, my mother was still waiting for me to become grateful. The pen lay beside the contract, silver, heavy, positioned at a perfect angle. She had always been good at arranging objects, so they looked innocent. You don't have to answer this second, she said, which meant she expected an answer before anyone left the room. Brielle reached for my hand again, but I moved it to the edge of the folder. Graham watched that small movement like it had legal meaning. Before anyone could push the pen closer, my mother cleared her throat and turned toward the far end of the table. While we're all together, she said, there's one more loving conversation we need to have. That was when I understood why Lenora Pike had been seated beside Pastor Clark all evening, small in her navy coat, her purse still on her lap. My mother had told me Lenora was invited because no one should spend Thanksgiving week alone. I had believed that because some foolish part of me still wanted to. Graham opened a second folder. This one was gray, without ribbon. Mrs. Pike, he said, using that careful voice people use when they want old age to sound like incompetence. Harbor Grace has prepared a transition proposal that would give you stability before winter. He slid the papers toward her. Maple Ridge Transition Plan. Preliminary Listing Authorization. My chest tightened before my mind caught up. Lenora's house. Her porch with the chipped green rail. Harold's workshop behind the garage. The kitchen table where I had built the first tracking sheet. Lenora did not touch the papers. I did not ask to sell my house, she said. Her voice was thin, but it did not bend. My father leaned forward with the tired patience of a man explaining rain to a child. Lenora, at your age, independence can become dangerous. My mother added, Maribel loves you. We all know that. But love is not a care plan. Martin nodded like that settled something. Brielle looked down. Again. That was becoming her whole language. Then Graham said the sentence that split the night open for me. No one is taking anything from you, Mrs. Pike. This is simply about making better use of underutilized property. Underutilized property. Not home. Not memory. Not the last place Harold's coffee cup had sat beside the sink. A property. I looked at Lenora's hand. It was wrapped around her purse strap so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Beside her, Pastor Clark had stopped blinking. Graham turned one page toward me by accident or arrogance. I saw a signature line already filled in with Lenora Pike's name, shaky and uneven, the signature that did not belong to the hand I knew. Lenora saw it too. Her mouth opened, then closed. That is not how I sign, she said quietly. Pastor Clark heard it. So did Graham. My mother made a soft sound of embarrassment, as if Lenora had forgotten manners instead of recognizing her own name being used against her. I did not reach for the paper yet. Not then. If I grabbed too early, Graham would call it emotion. If I spoke too loudly, my mother would call it instability. So I sat very still and looked at the wrong signature. The transition plan, the CEO who had called a home underutilized, and the family that had mistaken silence for consent. For the first time that night, Graham had made a mistake he did not know he had made. He had assumed old meant forgetful. He had assumed quiet meant alone. I waited until the room started breathing again. My mother reached for the gray folder, probably to tuck the ugly part back under manners, but Graham touched the edge first. We can review signatures later, he said. The important thing tonight is intent. Intent. Men like Graham loved words that could step around facts without looking guilty. Lenora had already said no. The paper said yes. Somewhere between those two things was the truth, and I knew better than to chase it while everyone was watching my face for instability. I need air, I said. My mother looked relieved, mistaking retreat for surrender. Of course, honey. Take a minute. She said it gently, for Pastor Clark. I pushed my chair back, left the contract and both folders on the table, and walked through the kitchen to the back porch. The cold hit my face clean and hard. For the first time all night, no one was looking at me. That was when I pulled out my phone and called Tobias. He answered before the second ring. He always did when my voice sounded too calm. I need legal and finance to pull a land search, I said. Maple Ridge Road. Pike property. Anything within 2 miles acquired in the last 18 months by Harbor Grace, Graham Sutter, or an LLC with his fingerprints on it. Tobias did not ask why. I heard keys moving. I'm putting legal on it now, he said. Then I asked for the metadata packet on the assistant contract, the original June Mercer logs, and any executive access tied to Harbor Grace's visible medication records. Already preserved, he said. Legal hold draft is ready if you want it. While he worked, I called Carmen Bell. Carmen had been a legal assistant at Harbor Grace until 6 months earlier, when she left quietly and sent ElderBridge 3 anonymous warnings no one on my team had been able to fully verify. She answered in a whisper, "I wondered when you'd call." I stepped farther from the kitchen window. "Graham has a transition proposal for Lenora Pike," I said. "With a signature she says is not hers." Carmen went silent long enough for the porch light to buzz above me. Then she said, "Maple Ridge, of course." The first file Tobias already had queued came through as Carmen was still on the line. 4 parcels around Lenora's house had been purchased over the past year by Sutter Creek Development, a limited liability company registered through a lawyer in Lancaster. 1 parcel north, 1 behind the old church lot, 2 along the access road. Lenora's house sat in the middle like the last tooth in a jaw. Carmen exhaled when I read the name. "That's Graham," she said. "Not on paper, but everyone in legal knew." Then she forwarded me an email she had kept because, in her words, "Some men write their intent like calendar reminders." The email was from Graham to his development consultant. "If Pike signs before Thanksgiving, we control the ridge." 14 words. No family-centered care, no stability before winter, no loving transition, just control the ridge. I stared at that sentence until the cold stopped feeling cold. Then Tobias sent the second packet. The assistant contract had been created by G. Sutter, admin before my mother's thread ever began. The transition proposal for Lenora had been created from the same device profile, same office license, same template family. Graham had not wandered into my family's ambush. He had furnished it. The third packet was June Mercer. Original log, visible log, access trail. The 8:00 p.m. entry shown to June had been edited after 11:30 that night from an executive override account. Not a nurse. Not an aide with too many rooms and too little time. Executive access. A clean record made for families, regulators, and frightened old women who were easier to dismiss if they doubted themselves first. I looked through the kitchen window at Graham, laughing softly with my father, at my mother smoothing the tablecloth, at Lenora sitting with her purse gripped in both hands. I could have walked back in and blown the room apart. Part of me wanted to. The younger part. The part that had stood at Lenora's kitchen table 10 years earlier, furious at a system that let pain hide inside paperwork. But proof is not the same as timing. If I went in too soon, Graham would make it sound like a misunderstanding. My mother would make it sound like an episode. So I saved every file, sent copies to my secure drive, and texted Tobias one line. "Stay ready." Then I turned toward the door, understanding that the truth was worse than I had guessed. Graham did not just want me quiet. He wanted Lenora's house, Brielle's signature, June's silence, and my family's shame all working for him at the same table. I stepped back inside with my phone in my hand and my face arranged into nothing. That was another skill my family had mistaken for weakness. A quiet woman can look empty when she is full of evidence. My mother was refilling coffee cups with the desperate cheer of someone trying to move a room past an inconvenience. Graham stood near the sideboard, laughing softly with my father, one hand in his pocket, his shoulders loose again. He thought I had gone outside to collect myself. He did not know I had gone outside to collect him. I did not return to my chair right away. I stopped beside Pastor Clark and lowered my voice. "Would you mind staying at the table for the rest of this conversation?" I asked. "If this is about care and dignity, I think someone outside the family should hear it clearly." His eyes moved from me to Lenora, then to the gray folder. Whatever he had been telling himself about good intentions thinned in that moment. "Of course," he said, not loudly, but firmly enough that my mother looked over. Then I took my seat and turned to Graham with the politeness my mother had trained into me and never expected me to weaponize. "Mr. Sutter," I said, "before we talk about signatures, I want to understand something. Did Harbor Grace prepare Mrs. Pike's transition proposal before or after she requested it?" My mother stiffened at the word requested. Graham smiled as if I had asked a child's question. "After, naturally. We never pressure seniors. Consent is the foundation of care." He said it cleanly, Pastor Clark heard it. Lenora heard it. I let the sentence settle on the table like dust. And the assistant contract? I asked, turning to Brielle. Who prepared that? Brielle glanced at Graham, just once. Too fast for my mother to catch. Not too fast for me. I did, she said. I asked HR to move quickly because I love you and I'm worried about you. Her voice warmed on the last part, the way it always did when she wanted to believe kindness erased control. Graham lifted his water glass. Martin nodded. My father looked relieved again, as if an answer given confidently was the same as an answer being true. I folded my hands beside the blue ribbon folder. Not on it, beside it. So, the proposal came after Lenora asked for help, I said. And the job contract came from Brielle. Graham's smile sharpened. That is what everyone just said. My mother let out a soft, nervous laugh. Maribel, sweetheart, this isn't a deposition. I looked at her then. No, I said. Not yet. The room changed. Not dramatically. No one gasped. But I felt the air draw itself tighter around the candles. Graham set his glass down. I think emotions are running high, he said. There it was. The first attempt to move the truth into my temperament. I smiled, because now he was doing exactly what I needed him to do. Maybe, I said. Then let's keep it simple. I placed my phone face down on the table, close enough to remind him I had brought something back from the porch, not close enough for him to see what. One question at a time. One answer at a time. Graham looked at the phone. For the first time all night, his smile arrived late. Let's start with the job contract, I said. My mother made a small sound, the beginning of a protest, but Pastor Clark shifted in his chair and she swallowed it. I turned the blue ribbon folder so the first page faced the room. Brielle, you said you asked HR to prepare this because you were worried about me. My sister sat straighter. Yes, she said, but her eyes had moved to Graham again. I watched that look pass between them, quick and thin as a paper cut. I opened to section 9. Then you can explain why an executive assistant contract includes a restriction against Eldercare technology vendors. Martin frowned. That sounds standard. It doesn't, Pastor Clark said quietly, and everyone looked at him as if the furniture had spoken. Graham leaned forward, hands relaxed. Many companies use broad language to prevent conflicts of interest. Nothing unusual. His voice was smooth enough to skate on. Miss Hayes is reading legal language through an emotional lens. I nodded once. Like that answer helped me. So it's standard. Yes, Graham said. And Brielle prepared it. Brielle opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I tapped my phone awake, opened the file properties screenshot, and turned the screen toward the table. Not dramatically. Just enough for the people closest to me to read it. Then, why was the document created by G. Sutter, admin before my mother's email thread ever started? For a second, the room did not understand what it was seeing. My father leaned closer. Celeste's hand froze on her coffee cup. Brielle whispered, "What?" Graham's face changed only around the eyes. That was how men like him panicked, not with noise, with calculation. Templates come from corporate, he said. That proves nothing. I looked at Brielle. Did HR send this to you? She looked down at the contract as if it had become unfamiliar in her hands. Graham said legal had a clean version. My mother stepped in fast. So what? He helped. That doesn't make this sinister. No, I said. Helping does not make it sinister. Hiding does. I scrolled to the second screenshot. The same device profile created the transition proposal for Lenora. Lenora's fingers tightened around her purse. Pastor Clark leaned forward. Graham's jaw flexed once. You had no right to pull internal files, he said. There it was. Not denial. Ownership. I let the silence hold him in place. I didn't pull your internal files, I said. You emailed one to my family thread, and the other was shown to a woman who says she never authorized it. Graham's smile tried to return and failed halfway. This is becoming inappropriate. I looked at the gray folder, then at the blue one. No, Mr. Sutter. Inappropriate was putting a muzzle in one folder and someone else's house in the other. My mother whispered my name like a warning. But for the first time that night, no one at the table moved to stop me. Graham looked at the two folders like they had betrayed him by existing in the same room. "This is not a boardroom," he said. "This is a family dinner." His voice still had polish on it, but now I could hear the metal underneath. I looked at the candles, the pie plates, the contract with my name printed neatly beneath the signature line. "You brought the boardroom here," I said. "You just expected everyone else to call it concern." Then I opened the email Carmen had sent me and placed my phone where Pastor Clark could read the screen first. "If Pike signs before Thanksgiving, we control the ridge." I read aloud. The words landed harder than any accusation could have. Lenora closed her eyes. My father whispered, "What ridge?" Graham moved fast then. "Development planning is separate from resident care." "Not when you use resident care to get the land," I said. He turned toward my mother. "Celeste, this is confidential business material." My mother looked at him, waiting for the version that made her useful instead of used, but none came. I opened the parcel map next. 4 properties around Lenora's house, all tied to Sutter Creek development through the same Lancaster attorney. Pastor Clark leaned over the table, slow and deliberate. "Mrs. Pike," he said. "For clarity, did you ask Harbor Grace to prepare this sale plan?" Lenora sat straighter. "No," she said. "And I said so tonight." Graham cut in. "Elderly clients often resist transitions at first." Lenora turned her head toward him. "I am old, Mr. Sutter. I am not absent." Then I called Tobias on speaker. His voice filled the dining room, calm and exact. The June Mercer record shown to the resident lists medication completion at 8:00 p.m. The original system log shows 10:17 p.m. The visible record was edited later from an executive override account. Brielle's face drained. "You told me those were clerical variances," she said to Graham. He did not look at her. "Facility staff make mistakes." I tapped the next file. Carmen Bell's forwarded email appeared below June's log. "No family needs to see timing gaps if no adverse event occurred." That was when Brielle finally turned on him. "You knew?" Graham lifted one hand. "I knew we had reporting inconsistencies during a sensitive transition period. Even then, he tried to make harm sound administrative." Brielle looked at me. Confusion folding into fear. "Why do you have original ElderBridge logs?" The question came softly, but it pulled every eye in the room toward me. My mother's mouth opened. My father stopped breathing through his nose. I let the silence last one clean second. "Because ElderBridge is mine," I said. No one moved. "I founded it 10 years ago, after Harold Pike missed a pain dose because 3 care systems couldn't talk to each other. I own 54%. Harbor Grace's contract crosses my desk. Your risk file crossed my desk. And this assistant contract was written to keep me from speaking about any of it." My mother's face changed from shock to calculation so quickly, it hurt more than the laughter would have. Ronald whispered, "Maribel." I looked at him. "You didn't want me normal, Dad. You wanted me easy to explain." Then I turned to my mother. "And an hour ago, I was your problem. Now I'm impressive. That means you didn't change your mind about me. You changed your estimate." Graham did not threaten me in the way foolish men do. He did not raise his voice or point a finger. He adjusted his cuff and said, "You should be careful about making claims that affect active contracts." It was almost elegant. Almost. I looked at the blue folder, then at the gray one, then at June Mercer's record glowing on my phone. "ElderBridge will issue a legal hold tonight," I said. "We will preserve patient safety functions, but every Harbor Grace expansion module, growth dashboard, and non-essential integration is frozen pending review." The words did what shouting never could. They made consequences visible. Brielle stood so quickly her chair scraped the floor. "The board needs to know," she said, and for the first time all night, she sounded less like our parents' chosen daughter and more like a woman realizing the room she had climbed toward was on fire. "I'm withdrawing my commitment package until council reviews it." Martin stared at her. "Brielle, that's $265,000. She looked at him, pale and shaking. Then it should have been worth telling me the truth. Pastor Clark placed one hand on the gray folder and slid it back toward Lenora. Mrs. Pike has said no, he said. Any further pressure tonight would not be care. It would be coercion. Lenora's breath trembled once, then steadied. She picked up the folder with 2 fingers, as if it were something spoiled, and pushed it away from her plate. My house is not available, she said. Not to Harbor Grace, not to Sutter Creek, not to anyone who waits until I'm tired to ask. My mother began to cry then, not loudly, not beautifully. Maribel, sweetheart, she whispered. My brilliant girl. I almost laughed, but it would have come out broken. An hour earlier, I had been drifting, difficult, embarrassing. Now I was brilliant because my silence had acquired a valuation. No, I said softly. You don't get to change the name of what you did just because the number changed. Her face folded inward. My father looked older than he had when dinner began, and for once, he had no sentence prepared. What happened after that was not cinematic. There was no police officer at the door, no instant confession, no final speech that healed 32 years. There were phone calls, lawyers, an emergency ElderBridge board session before midnight. Harbor Grace suspended Graham pending an internal investigation. Sutter Creek development became a name people started saying carefully. June Mercer's record was corrected, and more families were contacted than Harbor Grace wanted to admit. None of it felt like victory. It felt like pulling a thorn out slowly and discovering how deep it had been. Lenora stayed on Maple Ridge Road. The next Sunday, she invited me over for coffee and set 2 mugs on the kitchen table where Harold's tracking sheet had once been born. She had made a new place card from an index card and a black marker. Maribel Hayes, the woman who stayed. I kept it in my purse for weeks, not because I needed a title, but because I needed proof that someone had seen me clearly before the world was forced to. I did not stop loving my family that night. That would have been easier. I stopped letting their version of love decide where I was allowed to stand. Normal, I learned, was often just the box people built when your truth made their lives less comfortable. And after years of trying to fold myself small enough to fit inside it, I finally understood something Lenora had known all along. A quiet woman is not an empty woman, and a family table is not holy just because people call it home. The lesson I carry from Maribel's story is this. Sometimes the people who say they love us are not always loving the truest version of us. Sometimes they love the version that is easier to explain, easier to control, easier to place at the family table without disturbing anyone's comfort. And when we finally stop shrinking, they may call it rebellion, disrespect, or pride. But often, it is simply survival waking up. Family is supposed to be the first place where we are seen clearly. But in many homes, love gets mixed with expectation. Parents may call it concern when they are really protecting their pride. Siblings may call it help when they are really asking us to accept a smaller life so their own life feels bigger. And the hardest part is that this kind of harm does not always arrive shouting. Sometimes it comes wrapped in a nice folder, spoken in a gentle voice, served after dessert, with everyone insisting it is for our own good. But real love does not need to erase your voice to protect you. Real love does not ask you to sign away your dignity. Real love does not make you feel guilty for having boundaries, talent, grief, or a purpose that other people do not understand. The people who truly love you may worry about you, but they will not require your silence as proof of loyalty. Maribel's strength was not loud. It was steady. She did not become powerful in that dining room because she owned a company. She became powerful because she trusted what she knew, protected the vulnerable, and refused to let other people define her reality. That is resilience, not pretending pain never happened, but learning how to stand inside the truth without apologizing for it. So, maybe the lesson is simple. Do not let anyone make normal the price of being loved. Your life does not have to fit inside someone else's explanation. Your worth is not decided by the people who underestimated you before they knew what you carried. If this story touched something in you, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself?